I am now going to call this debate to order. On the resolution resolved, America should embrace radical systemic change to address racism. Like I said, we have our first few speeches planned out, and I'll let you know when it's open for any old person to raise their hand. But first, I'd like to ask for a speech in the affirmative from Gregory Sewell. Greg, go ahead. You have up to 4 minutes.
Okay, thanks for that, Madam Chair. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, spectacular.
Wonderful. Okay, I'm gonna just jump right into it. So, first of all, good evening, everyone. I am Greg Sewell. I'm a longtime tech consultant from LA and the founder of Change Agent, which is a new community-based think tank in the LA area, empowering people to change their minds, to change their world. So I'm really pleased to participate in the debate today, affirming the position of a response to systematic racism in the US and share my viewpoint as I learn from the rest of you as participants. So a little about me. I am an American born and bred from Houston, Texas. I have a passion for people, progress, and processes. I have an amazing wife, 4 children, and 15-year-old technology consulting practice, which is probably the toughest out of all of those. I'm a patron of love and equality, and I believe that people everywhere can change the world if they put their minds to it. So that's why I love this conversation. Thanks to Braver Angels for allowing me to be a part of it. So now right to it. So as I said, I'm affirmative, very much into the thought that America should embrace radical systematic change to address racism. And I believe that because of really 2 simple points, and so I'm gonna get right to them. Point 1, together, we're the solution. Together, we're empowered to progress. So I want to share an amazing piece of wisdom that I picked up in my years of consulting, and it is, of course, from the wise philosopher Dilbert. So there is a Dilbert comic, for those of you who are old enough to know it, that goes like this around change management. It's Dilbert talking to his manager. His manager says, "We're hiring a director of change management to help employees embrace strategic changes." So Dilbert thinks about it and he says, or we could come up with strategies that make sense. Then employees would embrace change. So the manager thinks about that and he says, that sounds harder. So in my line of business, I deal with groups of people who believe they're doing everything right, but somehow things aren't going right. So they need a little help. And so I believe all of us who've worked with other people in any job, I don't know who anyone who has not, we believe that anytime you try to change things, you find out a little bit more than you bargained for. And here's the tried and true maxim, systems, machines, stuff have problems, but the people really are the solution. So I believe that, the people here in this group really are the solution, for the problems that we have today in our country, but specifically the problems that we face as a result of systematic racism. So positive changes don't come without a clear idea of what you want to change. So here we go. Let's talk about the changes that we want to the system. I think the system, as we understand it collectively, needs to be the US social system, not just politics, but the government and the governed and the relationships to internal and external entities. Also, it's what you want to happen. So what I believe we want to have happen is produce a productive, high-functioning society. And we want to advance the quality of life for all Americans and our partners. How willing are we to change? Urgent. That's why we need radical change. How do I know? Because once, like you, if something changes my daily life, I pay attention. So how have things changed? They've changed pretty drastically over the last 4 to 12 weeks, depending on how you see it. Because not only have we been dealing with this, but we've also been dealing with the coronavirus. And so protests, law proposals, groups, discussions are popping up with lightning.
1 minute, unmute and keep going. It's always easy to find the mute button until you're speaking. Oh, Greg, we're gonna need you to unmute in order for us to hear the rest of your speech.
Yep, I said, could you hear me? Yep.
Oh,
yep.
Now we can.
Sure. So finishing up, I think the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act is a great example of something that's popped up quickly. People are risking their lives to protest together, even as we are trying to live in an area of increase and enhance safety with the coronavirus. So we think something needs to change. Second point, simply, if we engage together with the process, we'll win together. If we don't engage, we'll lose together. So I've also had the pleasure of working with a lot of community groups, and simple and plain, the main thing, point one, is always you have to have your fundamentals in order. I believe that Americans all believe in the Constitution. We believe that we are important to our own success. And the simple fact is we had amendments, so things change. We can change together. So what does it mean for this discussion? It's okay to have differing opinions. The understanding we do need to come up with something. We need to respect each other to allow us to work together. It's okay to work at something over time, but we reserve the right to make changes quickly as necessary. So I'm pleased to be able to share this information and look forward to the rest of the conversation. Thanks.
All right, well done. You kept to exactly 4 minutes. So jazz hands for our first speaker. Yeah. All right, folks. I'd like to know if there are questions for the speaker. And so go ahead and raise your little blue hand in the Manage Participants pane if you have a question. I see Joe Pratt. Joe, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
This is Joe.
Yes,
Joe.
I'd like to ask the speaker if he has any examples of countries or societies that have implemented radical systemic change successfully.
All right. Go ahead, Greg, unmute.
Hi, I do. I would say an obvious example of this from a historical point of view, whether you agree about it or not, is Germany. Because Germany has had a lot of trauma that people have had to deal with. And you can easily find articles today in social media and regular media to say, how would I be able to verify that for myself? There's a lot of information out there. So I really encourage you to look at Germany as an example of someone who had a traumatic event around race and around the treatment of race. That can be useful.
All righty.
Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Yeah. One other thing that I forgot to mention earlier, and you guys both followed that just now. So, but there is a 1 minute, you can take up to 1 minute to ask your question, up to 1 minute to answer, just because otherwise we found that questions can become little speeches. So you both followed that rule, but just wanted to point it out. All right, I'd like to call on Marcia. I don't see a last name, M-A-R-C-I-A, but go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Sure. Madam Chairman, I'd like to ask the speaker, what would radical change look like? What would be the radical changes he would envision?
Great. Greg?
Hi. So Marcia, thanks for your question.
So actually, sorry, I'm just going to be super awkward here. You have to say, I thank the questioner. You can't say thank you directly.
Got it. Okay. Well, thanks to the questioner. And I think two of the radical changes that I would posit to everyone for consideration are, bottom up thoughts of what can be done in a community instead of always saying there's one change that needs to be swept across all communities. That would be one radical change that everyone could engage in and that you could implement because you would have the backing. The second one would be, having funding set aside to produce these kinds of changes. That would be a radical thing that a lot of people might appreciate to control their funds. Thank you.
All righty, wonderful. With that, the speaker's thanked. And we're gonna give jazz hands for our brave first speaker and brave questioners. Well asked and well answered. Also, just so you all know, we, just because there's been so much interest in this, we will probably have every time more people who want to ask questions than can answer, than we can have time for. And so I apologize for that. We'll get as many voices in as we possibly can. So with that, I'd like to move to a speech in the negative. So please go ahead and raise your hand. And for a speech in the negative, I'd like to call on Daryl Theus. Daryl, go ahead and unmute yourself. You have up to 4 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And so glad to be here again. Thank you. The suggestion that there are practices that include discriminatory acts against different races and ethnicities, to me, is non-existent. We hear the term systemic change often. I firmly believe that perhaps there was a systemic racism, but today it doesn't exist. It doesn't exist because it's not legislated. It's not lawful to be racist. At the time of Jim Crow, Plessy versus Ferguson, after Reconstruction, but before the 60s, yes, I would probably affirm that there was systemic racism. But today, no. There are far too many examples of success stories from minorities from all walks of life. President Obama, Oprah Winfrey, Thomas Sowell, the list goes on and on. Were there truly systemic racism, they could not have evolved. They could have not have become the successes that they would become. And I maintain that very firmly. I don't think there's any evidence that one could put forth that there is systemic racism. So I would say that there's no change, no radical change needed. And if I could pose a question to the previous speaker, had not the Floyd incident taken place, would you have felt that this needed?
Would he have felt? Sorry, just gonna be real strict about that. Go ahead and unmute and keep going.
Would the speaker agree, would he still maintain the feeling that radical change would be needed had that incident not taken place? I'll yield to the chair. Thank you.
Alrighty, great. Jazz hands for Mr. Theus, whose byline, by the way, or like username is Lincoln Admirer. And so as Braver Angels, we are particularly fond of this. All right. Oh, yes. And there's a bust. Oh, my gosh. Wow. A Lincoln bust right there. Even cooler. You get bonus points, man. All right. Are there questions for Mr. Theus? I see.
Yeah,
Jefferson
I wanted
Wren.
to say something if I could.
Sorry. No, I have to call on people. And we will get to as many as possible. I see Jefferson Wren. Go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
I would like to ask the chair what the previous speaker would say when confronted with perhaps some statistics such as when the police interact with certain minorities, they tend to treat them differently than when they interact with other minorities, or how it manifests in, if you look at our system of mass incarceration, most people would point to that as perhaps the biggest symbol of systemic racism. And you have millions of people every single year jailed mostly because of nonviolent drug offenses. I think it's like more people are arrested every single year for possession of marijuana, nonviolent, than all the violent crime in the United States combined. And yet it seems to disproportionately impact people of color. So just given this additional piece of evidence, how would the previous speaker likes to respond?
All right, go ahead, Daryl.
Thank you. It's quite simple. I maintain that those acts are the acts of rogue individuals and not an institution. It is not a systemic, it's not a systemic institution that's causing that. Rogue individuals within the framework of that.
All right. And for a second question, let's go to Helen. No last name, but there's a Helen out there. Go ahead and unmute.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question for the speaker is, even supposing that today there is no governmentally instituted systemic racism, would you agree?
Would he? Mm-hmm. Unmute, sorry, I had to mute you.
Would he agree or disagree that there is, that past government policy still impacts communities of color disproportionately? For example, the history of redlining causing huge differences in the amount of wealth owned by white families versus Black families, and ought the government or society do something to address the continuing effects of past government discrimination?
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you for the question. Look at all of us here present. Would you not agree that we—
Would she not agree? Mm-hmm. Sorry. Gotta unmute again.
Would she not agree that we all have access to the American dream? I think we do. And I think all of us would agree that we do. there are policies that exist. They're interpreted in such a way where they're skewed unfavorably towards some ethnic groups, some racial minorities. Systemically, no. We live in too legitimate, our society is there's too much litigation afoot. Too many lawyers have a lot to gain were such racism, if it did exist that way.
All right, wonderful. And because that speech was so short, I will actually take one more question from Manjula Ambur. Might be butchering that. Apologies if so. Go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yes, Madam Chair. I just want to make a comment.
So this is a question time. If you can make your comment into a question, I will allow it. So unmute if so.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The question to the speaker is, I didn't know much about racism, the history of it till recently. I'm an immigrant, and I have seen the best of America. I have used the best of opportunities. But my learning in the last year about our history is very bothersome. There's so many inequalities seem to be at every single level: the education, the wealth, the jobs, and mass incarceration. I feel like there is systemic, maybe there are no laws, but the society, the culture has not done enough to address these issues, and we are seeing the effects of it. I'd like to get your comment, Madam Chair, the speaker's comment. Thank you.
So what does he think of that? Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
As an outsider, I guess one might, where they're bombarded with the media that we're bombarded with, they might think that America is unfair to its minorities. How could they not? However, statistics do prove the opposite of that. I would ask, if you can, instead of looking at the media that you do look at.
I'm gonna ask him to put it in third person. Ask her to put, her media she looks at and that sort of thing. Go ahead and unmute.
If opportunity were to present itself, I'd ask that all of us go to communities where there are successful minorities and see how they exist. I think you would find that America's been very good to its minorities, much so, far greater than other Western world countries have been to their minorities.
All right. And with that, the speaker is thanked. Jazz hands for our first negative speaker and the questions. Well asked and well answered once again. Alrighty, I'm now looking for a speech in the affirmative, and I'd like to call on Silas Kulkarni. Silas, go ahead and unmute yourself, and you have up to 4 minutes. We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you to the previous speakers. Also to the Lincoln lover, I share your heart. I'm going to just enter this debate from a different perspective because, so as might be obvious, I'm neither black nor white. My father was an Indian immigrant. My mother is, she could be if she wanted to be, a daughter of the American Confederacy. She's from a small town of West Virginia, and back before when it was Virginia. And I grew up in Houston, Texas, and growing up I experienced, just to tell you who I am and where I'm from. Hey, what's up, Greg? Just to tell you who I am and where I come from in terms of what I'm saying. I experienced a very large amount of rather overt racism growing up, people yelling racial slurs at me, threatening violence or engaging in violence. That was just, in the 80s and 90s in Houston, Texas, that's just what it was, okay? But this speech isn't about that, because I'm not actually here to talk to you about individual acts of racism. I'm here to talk to you about a system. And when I talk about a system, I need to talk about the neighborhood I grew up in, because I grew up in a neighborhood that was riddled with crime. The first time I was threatened with a knife was at 9 years old. My neighbors were murdered. It was just a regular occurrence to get robbed in my neighborhood, okay? And my school I went to sucked. All the schools I went to sucked in the Houston public schools, and those were supposed to be the good schools, okay? And we had lots of encounters with the police. I know a guy from high school who was killed by the police. He didn't have a weapon, he didn't have anything. He was on drugs, he wouldn't take his hands out of his pockets, and they got scared and shot him, I suppose. Nobody really knows because they didn't have body cams back then, okay? All those things that were part of my experience growing up are why I'm speaking in the affirmative here. Because all those things are not just the result of individual choices. If you were to make the case that individual choices resulted in the outcomes we saw, it would be hard pressed to explain why the same group of people who were enslaved until 1865 are the ones who are the poorest today, who are the most incarcerated today, who are in the neighborhoods with the worst crime today, who suffer from the worst rates of education today. If we had started from ground zero and then just said, everybody experience America in the beautiful American dream, and then the outcomes came out unequally, then we could say, you know, different peoples, different cultures, individual choices, that's what results in the outcomes. But that's not what we see. In fact, at the very end of Jim Crow, people talk about slavery. Let's talk about Jim Crow. Jim Crow ended in the late 60s. At the very moment that Jim Crow ended, the tough on crime movement began, okay? And mass incarceration began. And then it followed on to the drug war. And the number of people incarcerated today, roughly 3 million, is strikingly similar to the number of enslaved people directly before the Civil War. And the
1 minute, unmute and keep going. You were at 3 million. Silas, you have to unmute. Sorry.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
You were at 3
I'm going to
million.
give you a few stats. Yeah, I'm going to give you a few stats that I think should make us think that we have to address this from a systemic, not individual lens. Median white wealth in this country is $171,000. Median black wealth is $17,000. That's roughly 10 times. So the rate of being a victim of murder, I'm not talking about a perpetrator, a victim of murder is in the same ballpark, roughly 10 times. Incarceration rates are roughly 5 times. If you look at all of those situations, whether it's the incarceration and criminal justice system, the wealth and taxation and income system in the US, or education systems where black and brown kids are about 4 years less well educated by a system that's supposed to educate everyone equally, what you'll find is that across those systems, those are systems changes. System of policing, system of wealth, taxation, and income, and the system of education. So if we're going to address what has been done wrong, we're going to take a time to actually undo what was done or make right what was made wrong. Then we have to address those at the systems level. And with that, I yield to questions.
All right. Very good. It was exactly 4 minutes once again. Are there questions?
That's a
for the
lifetime
speaker?
first for me.
It totally is. I believe that. Are there questions for the speaker? I see Joe M. Joe M, go ahead and unmute yourself. You've been waiting, and ask your question.
Okay, Silas, Joe Mueller.
Sorry, you have to address it to me. So you have to say, Madam Chair, etc. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
I'm sorry I can't use madam because I used to hang out at houses of ill repute and it brings back some memories. The chairperson, how
Lady
about that?
Chair, sure.
How about chairperson? How y'all like
Okay.
that? See, that's supposed to be funny. A little levity. Silas, I have a response for you.
Sorry, you do have to, what I mean is you need to ask the question in third person. So you could say like,
Okay,
chairperson. Yes,
Chairperson.
I'd like to ask the
Okay.
speaker. Yeah,
Chairperson Silas mentioned, is that okay?
that's
Silas
great. Good job.
mentioned that back in 1960s, we had a big revolution. We had the anti-discrimination laws. We had the Equal Opportunity Acts come into effect. However, what's happened over the last 50 years is that for whatever reason, and that's what LBJ started this, where in what's happened over the last 50 years, fatherlessness in the black community is at 3/4 of the population. 3/4 of the black babies are born out of wedlock. What's happened over the last 50 years is that the black woman has kicked out the father, kicked out the husband, because of payments from the United States government. That's what's happened. So now,
I'm just going to remind you that this, you're going to get to a question, right? Excellent. Unmute yourself, and I believe in you. I'm sorry. There we go. Now it's working. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so my position is that because of this, you've got far too many black children that are raised with street morals, that is gangs, violence, et cetera, et cetera. Therefore, they don't get the education. They don't get this, they don't get that. And I just want to ask Silas, has he thought about that and does he agree with me? Thank you.
All right. Sounds good. Silas, go ahead.
I thank Joe for his question. And just judging by his accent, I'm guessing he's also a son of the South. And I'm just going to go out on a limb. I don't know if it's true, but I'm going to go out on a limb.
University of Houston, Holy Name Elementary School in North Side of Houston, St. Thomas High School on the west side.
What's up, Big Town? All right. You might love the Oilers like I love the Oilers, which is the team that nobody even knows about anymore. Excuse me, that the gentleman knows it doesn't. The gentleman might also love the Oilers. All right.
All right, Joe.
The gentleman and I have a lot in common on some metrics. And I'm not sure, but I'll just venture based on cultural background that the gentleman might, whether he is that way now or not, have had a Christian upbringing as well. And so I'm going to reference the Bible here. There's something in the Bible where Jesus says in Matthew that those who have will get more, and those who have less, even that will be taken from them. And I worked in education my whole life. I was a teacher, then I worked in education nonprofit. And this is referred to in education as the Matthew effect, which is if you start off with less, it's even harder and it gets worse and worse and worse. If you start off with more, it's easier and it gets better and better and better. And I'll tell you, when it comes to money, it's the same way. You have some, you invest it, you get more. You have none, you have to borrow, you get less. Okay. So when the gentleman is talking about family, I totally agree. Totally. Oh, my southern accent's coming out. I totally.
It is. Also, you're almost at time, but go ahead and wrap it up. Unmute though. Unmute, yes.
Okay. I went into education in large part because I lost my father at an early age, and I felt for those students who didn't have fathers. Okay. But if I asked, what is this fatherless rate and this rate of out of wedlock births, the biggest reason why a man doesn't want to marry a woman, and I'll say this from my own experience, doesn't have a job. He's in prison, he can't marry a woman. If he dies, whether from gunfire or from early disease, which is also much higher, he's not going to get married. So all these crises that hit America in the 60s and 70s, including, for example, the divorce crisis and the unmarried crisis, hit the most vulnerable the most. And so that'd be my answer to the question.
All right. Sounds good. So we're going to go with one more question. And Mr. Kulkarni, I'm going to have to ask you to make it a short answer since that one's a little long.
Sure.
We're going to go with Diane S. Go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Okay, thank you so much, Madam Chair. I actually had a tag of the first question that I was going to direct to the speaker, but I do have a second question. Is just being creative here. Are there any cultures that the previous speaker can think of? I come from the Philadelphia area, and we have a huge, say, Vietnamese culture here. And I'm just wondering, there seems to be something different going on with people that come here with nothing that seem to, and this is a perception that I have, pull it together as a family unit, as a community unit, and do not seem to be presenting internally or externally with the issues that we're hearing, let's say, from the Black culture. And I'm just wondering what's different. There are so many there are so many cultures that have come here with nothing. What do you think is?
What does he think? And go ahead and unmute and just wrap it up, yeah?
Yeah. What can we take from other cultures that we can monitor and attribute success and maybe pave the way there?
Okay, great. Mr. Kulkarni?
Madam Chair, just on a point of information or order, how much time do I have to answer the question?
1 minute.
Got it. Timer on myself. All right.
I love it.
So there's two big points here. First off, one, culture. People like to talk a lot about Black culture. And I know a lot more about Black culture than a lot of people who might speak in a negative, because I spent a lot of time growing up in neighborhoods that are mostly Black, and I taught in neighborhoods that are mostly Black. And I think we make a lot of assumptions about what Black people's culture is and isn't that aren't true. I've seen the hardest working single moms you've ever met trying to make it for their kids and going out of their way, okay? But culture is an adaptation to circumstances. Culture is a tool that we create to make sense of and to live with our circumstances. And so when cultures develop really radically differently and the circumstances are different, that's not a surprise. Two, no one comes here with nothing. You come here with your body, you're with your mind, your education, your relationships. My father came here with $0 in his pocket, but with education, with family, with supports. The kids I taught, that wasn't true. They came with trauma. They came in with deaths. They came with way less literacy in their families than mine, even though there was a language barrier. So it's not the same as starting from zero. It's like starting from having been robbed, which is literally what it was.
All right.
And I know I went over my own time, Madam Chair, sorry.
But not by much, only by a little. Alrighty, with that, the speaker is thanked. And I'd like us to offer some jazz hands for brave speaking and brave questions in keeping with the spirit of braver angels. So I'm now looking for a speech in the negative. Go ahead and raise your hand if you have a speech in the negative. We have one or two more planned ones, and then we'll open it up to the floor. So I'd like to call on John Wood Jr. Many of you know him. He's a Braver Angels leader himself. John, go ahead and share what you have to say.
Absolutely.
And you have only 4 minutes.
Only 4 minutes. I'm famous for not being able to say, for only getting started after 5. So we'll see how well we'll see how well I do. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Yes, I'm speaking in the negative with respect to the resolution. I'm not speaking in the negative with respect to the resolution, however, because I do not believe that significant structural change is needed, or at least could be beneficial in American life, particularly as it pertains to circumstances within the African-American community. I think that if you're looking at the systems of American society from a conservative perspective, there's plenty of reason to look at the educational system, for instance, a system in which many critics look at the propensity of that system to relegate people's educational opportunities according to zip codes in which they get fewer resources than other places, as a system that has a disproportionately negative impact on the Black community. If you look at our healthcare system similarly, people who are in a certain isolated geographical area have access to a healthcare system that tends to be underfunded relative to private healthcare. And it's worth keeping in mind the historical legacy of redlining and other policies that have planted African Americans and others in urban centers to begin with, where they find themselves unable to make a way out of that center, in which they are made sort of particularly vulnerable to the lack of adequate resources that come through some of these programs. This is from a conservative vantage point. In other words, looking at the educational system, looking at the various ways in which government programs incentivize more difficult sort of trajectory towards family formation. The critiques of the Great Society program are still relevant in our time. But then from a progressive perspective, it's easy to look at the criminal justice system, inequities in sentencing for drug usage, differing outcomes along the lines of color, depending on what substance a person is caught in possession of, whether crack or powder cocaine. No moral difference between the two, but the punitive disparity between the two dramatically impacts African Americans in a more difficult way. These are all systemic issues that are worthy of critique, worthy of review. My issue with the resolution is that we say that these things are necessary to impact racism in America. Now, you may take a definition of racism and say, well, if something has a disproportionately negative impact on a certain minority group, it is therefore institutionally racist. Fair enough, but it's worth remembering the fact that many of these policies that adversely harm Black Americans and poor Black Americans also adversely harm poor white Americans as well. It's just for various reasons. There are fewer poor white Americans as a matter of percentage, but then again, the histories of these different groups are different also. My beef with the resolution is that when we use the term racism, even when we say institutional racism, we give folks the impression that the United States of America is a broadly speaking racist country, when the larger truth is that interpersonal racism, racism between groups of Americans and between whites and blacks, has declined over the course of, well, over the larger course of American history.
1 minute, John. Unmute yourself and keep going.
And certainly since the end of the Civil Rights Movement. In the 1960s, Billy Graham led the first integrated revivals in the South. They brought Christian worshipers together from across the most racially polarized region in the United States of America. Going into the 70s, universities threw open their doors to people of colors and prized diversity and integration on the highest levels of academic society. Black people began to integrate middle class and upper middle class neighborhoods. Families like my own, the Wood family, which is a white Southern family, is now becoming through my children, a black family living in an urban community. And when my parents married, it was not necessarily the case that all of my relatives were happy about that on that side. And yet, over the course of a little bit of time and through exposure, there's a genuine love that unfolded and real acceptance that became the norm in our family over time. That has been the American story, broadly speaking, since the 60s. The thing that we have to differentiate between, and the thing that we have to celebrate, is that on the one hand, Americans are less racist today than they have been, certainly in generations past. On the other hand, we still need to look at the reality of systemic difficulties in American life today as it pertains to African Americans and other communities. If we can get these—
Okay, you're a little over time, so just wrap it up. You can unmute and keep going.
If we can get these two things right, then we can get to the heart of the problems.
Excellent. All right, very good. So I'm now looking for questions for the speaker. We're gonna go with Melinda. Go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question. No last name, so bit of a mystery woman, but Melinda. Yes, great.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you, Madam Chair. So I'd like to ask the speaker, I get the impression that you don't support—
That he, go ahead and unmute and keep going.
That they don't support the position because it's instituting radical change to address systemic racism. But would the speaker support the statement if it was changed to address systemic inequality?
Right. Yes, I would. I would say that with the caveat that I do think that one of the most difficult, one of the most pernicious impact of faulty systems in our society is the way in which they interact with the cultures of various groups in American society. And therefore, I would maintain the position that ultimately, so many of the social problems that we see are problems whose larger solutions are rooted in cultural changes that we can make within our own communities. That certainly applies to the African American community. But in looking at the faults of the educational system and in raising the sorts of questions that Joe from Texas raised and others, we've got to understand the fact that many of these cultures themselves have developed according to the pernicious impact of a legacy of, genuinely institutionalized racism going back hundreds of years, as well as the current state of affairs in which many of our contemporary systems interact with our culture in a pernicious way as well. And so these things are deeply related, but yes, that would be a much more acceptable, logical proposition to me. So I thank the questioner.
All right, very good. And next, just trying to get more voices in, we're gonna go to Terry Webb. Terry, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Madam Chair, first of all, I'd like to thank the speaker for his presentation, which I really agree with. But my question has to do with what the speaker thinks of the legacy of the racism that has been with us for so many generations. I call it vestiges of racism that has been with this country since 1819, when the first slaves arrived to help with the planting of cotton and tobacco in this country, and that is still with us with immigrants who come from different races. So how would you address that? I would call the
How would he address it? Unmute and keep going. Or I think we understand, that's fine. All right, John, go ahead.
Well, it sounded to me like the questioner was asking, how do I sort of evaluate the legacy of racism historically and culturally and its impact on us today. I think that the most underappreciated impact of the legacy of racism on the development of Black culture all the way up to now is the fact that unlike any other group that has come to the United States of America, African Americans in coming over as slaves are the only group of people who were come here in a manner that eradicated our memory of who we were culturally and our traditions and our economic and religious practices in a manner that gave the Black community no resources to deal with the ubiquitous persecution that met Black Americans in the earliest stages of well, obviously slavery, but the earliest stages of emancipation, and then for a century after that. Look, when Jewish immigrants and Latino immigrants and Asian immigrants come to this country, they too meet persecution, they too meet oppression, but they're also able to call upon the cultural memory of religious and economic and other strategies by which they're able to endure these things. African Americans in this country have had to create a culture from scratch. And so I could give a lot of examples.
You're at time, so no examples, but can wrap it up.
But just to say, though, that in asking that question, the elimination of our cultural memory is the place where you want to start.
All right, very good. And with that, the speaker's thanked. Jazz hands once again. Good questions, good answers. And yeah, so, okay, I'm now looking for a speech in the affirmative. Go ahead and raise your hand if you have one of those. This is the last planned speech. After that, we'll open up to the floor. Oh, yes. And this is very exciting. The next affirmative speech will be given by John's brother, Tyler Anderson. Tyler, please unmute and go ahead. You have up to 4 minutes.
Okay, I have a lot to say. Sure. 4 minutes is going to be rough, but I'm going to try my best. Okay, so I've noticed that a lot of the speakers previously, I believe that all of them are right in their own regard, but I do believe that a lot of us have the wrong interpretation of what radical systemic change would look like or what it has to be. So I'm just gonna do a brief rundown summary of the origin of American racism. Pretty much when African-American slaves were brought over to America, it was more or less used as a substitute for the Native American slaves that were dying out because of the germs, diseases. They weren't used to the Caucasian biology, of course. So African-Americans were able to work so much harder. They ended up using them rather than the Native Americans. But the one thing that a lot of people don't understand is that there were white slaves as well. And during this period of time, white slaves were treated as indentured servants, and so were the Black slaves. They were on equal terms at one point in history. However, they started to band together because no one wants to be a slave. No one does. Okay? So the only way to prevent that sort of thing from happening is to, as we see throughout history, divide and conquer. Provide a reason to separate each other, and the easiest thing to separate people by is a visual cue, the color of their skin. So they would give Caucasian slaves more resources than the African Americans to give them a reason to not team up, because if they teamed up, they have the risk of losing everything. Okay, so now that lasted for about 400 years. Some would even say 500 just because there are new slave mentalities that are going on. And the thing about this is that I'm sure all of us have habits and qualities that we inherit from our parents that we don't like, that we constantly have to regulate, that we have to think and impose rules on ourselves. Now think about it. That's just one generation away from your parents. Imagine 400 to 500 years of habits that have been encouraged and enabled into one's culture and into one's personality. There are things that we do that we don't even understand why we do them, right? So when African Americans were freed, we were freed within the white world. Yes, the system isn't written to be against African Americans, but it was written for Caucasians. Of course, they're not going to write, hey, this nation is for white people. These rules are for white people. Of course, they're not going to write that because they were the ones that considered themselves people. So they're not going to really articulate that sort of thing. But when African Americans were freed, they were freed inside of areas that they could afford. They couldn't afford anything. So they were in areas that were impoverished. They had poverty. They didn't have anything. So when you start
1 minute, unmute and keep going. Tyler, unmute. Yeah. 1 minute and keep going.
Of course, when you start from ground zero, there's going to be crime, there's going to be drugs, there's going to be trying to find alternative ways to make money, okay? And police officers, they're not necessarily acting out of racism, they're acting out of experience. The more people you see committing these crimes are minorities simply because they were released and placed in an area where they couldn't do much but break the law. You know, so it's not necessarily the system, but radical change needs to be acknowledging the problems within the system. We don't have to rewrite anything, but just acknowledge that there is a problem and write it down or present it as such.
Right. Well done keeping to time, and also you and your brother have some things in common. All right, are there questions for the speaker? I see Colette Harrison. Colette, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to ask the speaker to perhaps elaborate a little bit more on the distinctions that he just spoke of. Leave it at that.
Okay. Go ahead,
Okay.
Tyler. You have 1 minute.
Yeah. So pretty much the type of distinction that I'm speaking of is that a lot of people tend to think that radical change means rewriting the rules, but that doesn't necessarily have to be the case, as a lot of my contrarians have stated before, that the rules don't specify any type of racism. But the fact that this system was built for white people without articulating that, all the minorities have been suffering the lack of everything that that system provides for the people that it was written for, if that makes sense. So the radical systemic change is to literally just acknowledge that there is a problem. That's it. Just acknowledge it. Just acknowledge that, hey, these people.
Alrighty. Very good. I'll take one more question. Let's go with Don Gade from Fresno, California. You've been waiting. Go ahead and ask your question.
Yes.
To unmute yourself. Great.
And thank you for the previous speaker's points. I took an online test today looking for unconscious racism, and I was kind of surprised that, or maybe I shouldn't be surprised, that I am fairly racist. I just wanted this previous speaker, when you talk about changing institutional racism, radical change, isn't this maybe more of a cultural problem, cultural issue that we need to educate ourselves rather than passing laws? As one of the other persons said, we don't have racist, overtly racist laws, but isn't this going to need to be a cultural, educational change to, as you said, acknowledge that?
But he said, unmute and keep going.
Yes, that he said that we need to acknowledge it, and that we basically are all racist, and we need to come to terms with that and educate ourselves, and that will go a long ways towards solving this problem.
Okay.
What do you agree with that?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I 100% appreciate the questioner's comment, and it's 100% correct. You know, it's radical systemic change is not going to cure racism, but when you see a problem, there's a lot of people that don't understand that there is a problem. You know, like, as you said, you had to take a class to figure this out, you know, and you oftentimes need to set rules in place, or at the very least, just acknowledge that there are some intricacies of these rules that might affect other people differently. You know, it's like, yeah, it's not going to cure racism, but it's going to show that racism exists, if that makes sense.
All right. Very good. And with that, Tyler, also known as John's brother, is thanked. All right. So that is the end of our planned speeches, and I would now invite anyone to speak. And I'm looking for a speech in the negative. Now, just a reminder, if you'd like to give a speech, we would really encourage, you can just raise your hand, and I may call on you just out of the blue, and it'll be your little blue hand within Zoom. But I would also just encourage folks to send a chat to your whip and say, like, just tell them what you might want to say. And the reason is that we're tracking all this and trying to weave together a good debate. So that would help us. And Leslie has just put in the chat again, which if your first name starts with this letter, who you talk to. So I'd encourage folks to do that. For now, I'm looking for a speech in the negative. And let's go with Robert Foster. Go ahead and unmute, and you have 4 minutes, and we'll switch to 3 after this.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. We appreciate it. And Mackenzie, thank you so much for taking the lead role with my name. I appreciate it. Good evening, ladies. She's done a great job because she gives all the questions for our group, so we have to give justice to a person like that. So,
excellent.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to speak to all of you, and I really appreciate the time that we're going to have together within this call.
If you could come closer to your mic.
I'm sure.
It's a little hard to hear you.
I said I'm not blown away, but I'm in a position in my life where you can understand somewhat of my position where I think. I am a gentleman, and 2 other gentlemen, myself, we jumped up and went to Minneapolis to become part of the biggest nonviolent protest that the city did have, which was 30,000 people. And within those 30,000 people, we did not separate people by color during that protest. We did not turn to any individual and say, your hair is green, or you're Indian, or you're too small, or you're not tall enough. We did not state unequivocally by race, color, or creed that you could not participate inside of our protest, standing against the bills that have enabled everything and everyone who's on this call to be in this position. Being a Black male who was born and raised in sunny Southern California in South Central Los Angeles, in the high school that I did attend, ladies and gentlemen, we had 4 children. 4 children, when I say children, they were from the age of 14 to 18 that were killed in classes in my school. Subsequently, for us to get to a point inside of America where we're looking at using words, and key words and key phrases have a very vast, strong impact on the thought process of an individual. When we have a word as systemic or systematic, sometimes we don't have an opportunity to be able to understand the difference between the 2 words. And those 2 particular words, we have a vast difference in meaning. If you understand the question, and this is what a lot of us have not taken time to be able to answer, gentlemen. The question is, should we have systemic, radical racial change? The absolute answer is no. The unequivocal answer to this whole entire panel is no. Because when you use the word radical, does radical mean guns and violence? Does radical mean that other innocent individuals should be killed because of a person's radical thought process? I've been blessed. I've been extremely fortunate to live overseas for 15 years of my life. I lived in Italy for a year. I lived in Greece for 10 years. I lived in Nigeria for 2 years. I lived in Romania for 2 years. I've had the pleasure to be able to move across the world and to go into countries where even at this particular time, Americans are not looked at as friendly people. But when people use the word radical, are you saying that during these protests and the looting, ladies and gentlemen, that 23 Black males and females have been killed? That is more than the individuals who were killed last year in America with guns or without.
I'm going to mute you just for a second to mute everybody to see if we can fix this audio, and you have 1 minute left. So go ahead and unmute and keep going.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I appreciate your time. I'm going to close with this, ladies and gentlemen. I loved that Mr. Silas did take the time to be able to give us the statistical evidence. I loved how Mr. Sewell said he believed that there should be radical change. But if we take time to break down the words systemic and radical, those 2 words don't go together. We've been conditioned by the news. We've been conditioned by news and journalist outsources to be able to think that those 2 words belong in the same sentence. Excuse me. Radical means we stand for something. Systematic means we're going to stand against the system that is not allowing us to be progressive. And ladies and gentlemen, in 2020, in this world that we do live in, I would love to pay for. Anybody who's on this particular thread in this particular meeting, I personally would pay for you to get on a plane, and I will take you to some countries to see what radical change is actually needed to be able to become even half of what America is today. Whether it's race, whether it's color, whether it's gender, or whether it's economical.
I'm gonna cut you off there. Alrighty, thank you so much. I'm wondering if there are questions for the speaker. I see Anahita Mazaheri. Go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question. Anahita, we can't hear you yet, so if you would unmute yourself, that would be great.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, go ahead with your question.
Yes, this is Anahita. I don't have a question, but I wanted.
So this is a question period. If you'd like to make a speech, you can raise your hand next time and we can call on you. Alternately, if you can sort of make your speech into a question really quickly, you can offer it, but you have to unmute yourself again. So we still can't hear you. Go ahead and unmute. There you go.
Okay. My question is, why in United States the matter of racism or racial profiling is higher in general, is higher and more violent, you can say, in society, in American society compared to other countries in 21st century. And what I came up to that's a question. And what it came to my mind that I'm presenting for the past few years, I was thinking about it because personally, I'm not Black, I'm considered Caucasian, but I've been suffered because of the racial profiling so harshly for the past 18, 19 years. But the racial profiling was in different definition rather than color. But it was a racial, and the court decided it is a racial kind of profiling, which has damaged my life and my daughter's life in a horrible, it's just.
I'm sorry to interrupt. You are at time. You can unmute yourself and end your sentence if you want to, but you do have to unmute yourself to do that. Just the end of your sentence, yeah. Oh, sorry, we still can't hear you. There you go.
Okay, now what came up to my mind in approaching this question is prejudice in United States is so severe.
All right, great, thank you.
So if you approach it in any way.
I'm sorry, I'm just gonna interrupt you there because you're a little over time. So Mr. Foster, go ahead.
Madam Chairwoman, it's a pleasure to answer her question. Ma'am, you have stated something very unique.
So you've got to put it in the third person. She has stated something.
I'm so sorry. She has stated something that is very unique for us to be able to look at. Now, you stated that inside of America.
She stated, sorry, if you can just avoid the word you, actually, it's a tip for everybody. Go ahead.
Yes, ma'am. She has stated that she has found information that enabled her to understand that in America, we have a very high rate of violence. Ma'am, have you ever lived in any other?
Has she ever lived?
Has she ever lived?
There you go.
Of the country?
Yep.
I'm with you. Yeah, I need the hands, everybody. Give me the hands.
Yeah, the jazz hands for that.
Thank you for the jazz hands.
Yes.
Ladies and gentlemen, the reason that we have such statistics is because we are a statistic-driven country. We have to report certain things that other countries do not. Now, I live in Lagos, Nigeria, and they do not have to report the violence that goes on a daily basis. I've been to Mumbai, I've been to New Delhi, I've been to Goa. India does not have to report the violence that goes on a daily basis. So subsequently, we're in a position as the leading country of the world for us to have to be in a position that we have to give more truth. So unequivocally, for us to be in the position that we are in, yes, 73% of America at this time is Caucasian, male and female. At this time.
So you're at time. Go ahead and unmute and finish your sentence.
So we are in a position where we have to be able to report the truth. So thank you for your question, ma'am.
All right, very good. And I think for the next question, we will go to Silas Kulkarni, our prior speaker. Go ahead, Silas, unmute and ask your question. We still can't hear you. You don't appear to be muted.
My phone is muted, sorry.
He wanted us, Madam Chairwoman, to learn how to read lips well. So I'm okay with it.
That's right. Just take a
No,
moment
it
of
was
silence.
building anticipation.
That's right. All right, go ahead.
All right. So I said, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to Mr. Foster. My question is related to the previous. Mr. Foster says that we have only ever been to a more violent country. So I'd be curious if Mr. Foster could comment on, when we talk about violence, talk about police lethality in the U.S., okay? I'm not talking about to black people or any to white people. I'm saying just the number of people that are killed by the police in the U.S. Is Mr. Foster aware of, and what's his thought on the fact that the U.S. sits just better than the Democratic Republic of Congo on that metric and just worse than Iraq on that metric? And we're about 10 times worse than Canada and 100 times worse than the UK. And could he comment on why our police are so lethal in the United States?
Madam Chairwoman, I really appreciate Mr. Kulkarni's question. Thank you very much. I appreciate it, sir. Mr. Silas Kulkarni, as we sit in Los Angeles, California, which is the second biggest city.
Come back to your mic, sir.
I'm sorry. As I sit in Los Angeles, California, I'm sitting in the second biggest city in a state that is the fifth biggest economy in the world. So subsequently, as individuals and as people, if I'm walking down the street and I have a cell phone that is worth $800, but if it's released in America first, you know, on the black market, when they sell them on eBay and other outsources, they sell them for $3,000 to $4,000 per phone. So at this particular time, if we understand these things, the nature of violence in America is at an all-time position as it is, because we have a lot for people to take. Now, I will state this very quickly because Madam Chairwoman will click me off and push mute. The reason that we are in a position the way that we are is we have to re-educate the mind of an individual to understand that hard work is not something that is looked at as a bad choice in our life. We will re-educate the mind of our children to be in a position where we can say, ladies and gentlemen, being able to become Madam Chairwoman of this beautiful brave, it takes a lot of hard work. So we can appreciate each other. We can appreciate someone who's working hard. So those individual people, Mr. Silas, those people will never look at another person and become jealous, envious. As you are a man who knows Christ, those things are fruits of the flesh. You begin.
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great.
I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah, you're at time, but you can wrap it up.
I just wanted to wrap it up by saying, as I stated, sir, unequivocally, it is the reinvention and recorrecting of the mind so that we have the right installation of things that will be correct. Thank you for that question, sir.
All righty, wonderful. And with that, the speaker is thanked. Jazz hands, everyone, yes. And especially for the, I just really appreciate everybody's bearing with me on the addressing the chair. It really is important. And so, and thank you also to the early speakers who kindly showed us what it looks like when I interrupt you. So thank you for that. Now I am looking for a speech in the affirmative. And I see quite a few hands. That's good. Let's go with Jefferson Wren. Jefferson, go ahead and unmute yourself. You have 3 minutes this time. We're shifting to slightly shorter speeches.
Well, first of all, hello, everyone. I'm very glad to have heard everyone's perspectives. Also, I want to shout out Silas Kulkarni. I think I volunteered for your brother's congressional campaign. I'm also from Texas, from the Houston area, so I thought that was really interesting. So I want to talk about what it means for radical systemic change and what I think is like not good enough to solve the problem. So I think what doesn't address, first of all, like I believe racism is real in society, right? And the problem is it's not just interpersonal. So my concern is that if we just look at racism interpersonally, then it doesn't go to address the deeper problems. It doesn't fix a lot of things. So in a sense, like people tend to hang around those that are similar to them. And if there are people that are outside of your worldview, you have to somehow address them as well. And the only way to do that is through some sort of system, either through a government, city council, NGO, etc. Right? So for instance, if I'm in Sugarland and Sugarland, everything is going fine, and downtown Houston, a lot of people are facing a problem. Well, like if I just individually am nice to my friends here in Sugarland, it's not going to do anything, right? Like you have to have some form of system where my actions can impact them. So whether it's through voting or through some NGO, etc., like that needs to happen. And another thing is, I think there's a difference between symbolic and systemic action. So a lot of times you see in a city like New York, they just paint Black Lives Matter on a street and they change the street name, and then they don't do anything about how the police conducts itself or what the police budget is like, right? So then maybe 5 years later, another Black person gets choked out on Black Lives Matter street. And it's like you have symbolic action, but nothing happens. So I think that is a big problem, is why I think the term systemic is really important. And then on the term radical, I think is important because a lot of times we don't really go far enough to address something, right? The institutions of power really matter. So for example, if you have, let's say, Hispanic people are disproportionately hurt in terms of like their wages. They work like lower end jobs, right?
1 minute, unmute and keep going.
If they work as like farm workers, domestic workers, etc. Well, a non-radical action would be, let's just get like one more Hispanic on like the board of directors for Dole like fruit company or Tyson food manufacturing. But if like you don't actually have more radical change and you address the deeper issue of power, it's like, why are we not paying these undocumented workers more, right? Then you're not really going to address the problem. So what I'd like to say is, what we should not do is just symbolic, and what we should not do is just view it individually. And maybe we can disagree on these terms. We can get into a debate on the semantics, but I think it is really important that it is, in a sense, structural and systemic, and it does reach in a sort of radical direction to really impact power. So you don't have just like a minor tweak around the edges, but you have like the overall power structure by and large remaining. So that's why I would like.
Wonderful. All right. For our first college student speaker of the night, excellent. I'd like to know if there are questions for the speaker. I see Larry Lesser. Larry, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yes. First of all, I believe that the college student is from Rice, and so I'll do a jazz hand thing there. I'm from there too. So my question is, there's no question to me that there is systemic racism, and it's one thing to remove discrimination from the laws and to improve the training of police forces to make the future more level. But how do we quantify how much reparation is needed to address the damage already done?
Okay, great. Jefferson, unmute and go ahead. 1 minute.
So I appreciate the former question. And I would say that personally, I don't think we have to equate radical systemic change with just reparations. I think that, perhaps we should have that conversation, but I think it means a lot of things to a lot of different people. At the end of the day, what my view is, the overall power structure has to be different. So perhaps you just legalize marijuana and you solve the system of mass incarceration and you pay Black workers more, you allow them to organize more, you write visas in a way that doesn't disproportionately hurt lower income workers. And then you perhaps, just invest in minority communities instead of doing cash reparations to Black individuals. So I do think there's a worthwhile argument to be had on reparations, but I think overall, we don't need to get super caught up in the weeds of, one particular action. I think it is.
Time, unmute and finish up.
Yeah. But overall, we just need to think about like the system of power and how we can change that.
All right, wonderful. Further questions? I see Erica Munson. Erica, go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Hi, thank you. My question for Jefferson is, the word radical scares a lot of my conservative friends. I identify as liberal and progressive. And how do you define radical? And
how does he define radical? Unmute and keep going.
How does he define radical? Thank you for the correction. And what important democratic institutions do you think does he think need to be preserved while can democratic institutions be preserved while radical change is taking place?
All right, Jefferson.
So in regards to this, the former question, I do think there is a concern that people get caught up over words, and oftentimes people might, for example, the debate is all, should you say Black Lives Matter or All Lives Matter, but not talk about what actually needs to be done. So I think if you want to talk to your conservative or liberal friends, at the end of the day, what matters more is that we talk about what needs to actually happen. So some people may say, you know, let's not arrest nonviolent drug offenders and throw them in jail with minimum sentences, right? And then to me, that is a pretty radical change. That would impact hundreds of thousands of people every single year. But maybe perhaps to your friends, you wouldn't say like, oh, we're gonna like impart radicalism on this country. Perhaps we just need to talk about the actual policies and that are deeply substantive. So basically to answer your question, I think that-
This question.
Oh yes, to answer the previous question, what makes something radical is like how deeply it impacts, once again, like the power structure, but how we choose to frame it, you don't perhaps need to just get caught up on the words, is it radical, is it not, etc. Perhaps we just talk about like the impact and what it actually will accomplish.
All right, wonderful. With that, the speaker is thanked. I'm just gonna remind everybody, so we are rapidly, our time is just speeding by here. So we're actually gonna go down to 2-minute speeches now. And again, that's because quite a few people wanna speak and I wanna get as many of y'all in as possible. I also, just on the, a little tip on the address the chair thing, one way to make it easier is just don't say the word you. So don't say thank you, say I thank the speaker. Don't say you said this, say the speaker said that. So just think of the word. Robert Foster, who just got off, sent me a chat saying, I've just learned that you is a terrible word. And that's what I'm trying to teach y'all. So that's one easy way to think about it. So I am now looking for speeches in the negative. Go ahead and raise your hand if you have a speech in the negative. Righty. Melinda, go ahead.
Thank
2
you,
minutes.
Madam Chair. So what I want to say is kind of reflecting on what John Wood Jr. was saying in the beginning, that he would support this position if it was more addressing systemic inequality rather than systemic racism. And because I have a lot of family members who, although are extremely caring people, they have a hard time seeing themselves supporting these issues because it's so drenched in ideas of racism. Even though there might be real systemic racism, as in it affects different communities differently, these are problems that would exist and affect certain people even if racism wasn't a part of it. And by that I mean, you know, we can have problems with police lethality who are killing Black and white Americans, and that is an issue that definitely needs addressed. But if we frame it as a police are only killing Black people, when that's not necessarily true, you might lose support from people who think that that's a radical idea. I have friends who are constantly posting things on Facebook like, you know, you can't be proud to be an American anymore because that makes you a racist, you know. So yeah, I don't have a lot that I wanted to say other than to reiterate that.
Wonderful. Well, actually, you gave exactly the right length of speech. That was 2 minutes on the dot, so well done. And I'd like to see if there are questions for the lady. Let's go with John's brother, Tyler. And yes, that is what I'm going to call you.
Madam Chair, I would like to ask the speaker, well, first, I would like to say that I also agree that under all the technicality, that is not necessarily a race issue, rather it is a classism issue in regards to like literally the system. But would she agree that under the lower class where all of these systemic problems are occurring, would she agree that they are primarily minorities and primarily African Americans and also primarily Hispanics? You know, like, is that still something that should be addressed?
Right.
Thank you to the questioner. And yes, I do think that minorities are suffering a disproportionate amount of these problems, but that we can address these problems without making it about race, if that's what we need to do to get support for it. And there are people who aren't necessarily like racial minorities who are suffering these problems too. You know, you have economic inequality and educational inequality, and that can affect all kinds of people. And so I think if we address those problems, that, you know, you might end up addressing systemic racism just that way.
Alrighty. And with that, the speaker's thanked. And I go down to one question between speeches. Yes, jazz hands, absolutely. Thank you, those of you who are correcting me. Jazz hands for our speaker. Yes, we're going to go down to one question, and in a minute I may actually just not do questions because we're trying to get as many folks in as possible before what I know is everyone's bedtime. So at least those on the East Coast, I've been called out before for East Coast bias. Anyway, I'm now looking for a speech in the negative, and I see that was a speech in the negative. My apologies. I'm looking for a speech in the affirmative. Sorry, folks. And we're going to go with Helen. Helen K. Go ahead and unmute, and you have 2 minutes.
Thanks, Madam Chair. So I have a lot, just like some observations. Like, I'm kind of really interested in how diverse the opinions on both sides of this have been, and I feel like there's like different things that I'm swimming in. One is that there seems to be general agreement that like we should do something to address inequalities, but there's disagreements. Like, each word of this prompt is so individually controversial. Like, what does it mean to embrace systemic racism? Like, Americans embracing or America embracing, and then what does radical mean? What does systemic mean? What are the changes that we need? And then like, what is racism, and to what degree should we be concerned about racism specifically versus equality more generally? And I don't have like a way to respond well to each and every amazing point that has been made on both sides of this issue. But what I do want to share is just like a piece of my own family history and how I think about this, which is that my grandfather was a Jewish man who lived in the US during World War II and through the Great Depression. He worked as a child laborer during World War II, was very, very poor, didn't have a father. And because he was able to fight for the US during World War II and was a veteran, he was able to use the GI Bill to earn his college education in this country and to go on to become an optometrist, which was how my family was able to, in our own history, buy a home, buy our first home in that side of the family, to be able to afford his children's education that like then led the way towards me. And what I think about a lot is that his Black comrades in arms, many of them were barred from having access to the GI Bill. And so what I think about is actually specifically that whether or not that's still true today, my ability to afford my education, my expensive liberal arts education, I went to Oberlin, you know, there's all these things that I was able to do and afford. It has this direct link to the ways in which my grandfather, because he was viewed by this country as white at that time, even though he was also Jewish, was able to earn this degree that like people who had also fought in World War II who were Black weren't able to earn. And so the word I want to focus on is like should, and like with all the disagreements of like radical, systemic, whatever, there is to me a lingering injustice that my grandfather was able to earn this thing and his comrades could not. And that similarly, like,
you are actually at time, so if you would just wrap up, that'd be great. Unmute though.
Wrapping up very quickly, other policies such as redlining and housing discrimination, even if those policies are not still in effect, I think they have had an impact on differences today, and I think there should be something done reparatively for past wrongs beyond current issues.
All righty, very good. And due to the lateness of the hour, we're not going to take questions, so without the speaker is thanked. And jazz hands. It was an excellent, responsive and sort of gathering speech, so thank you for that. I'm now looking for a speech in the negative. We're going to go with Sherry Gilliam. You have 2 minutes. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
I'm supposed to have 4, but I'll go with 2. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
I'm not a tech person, so I don't do the Facebook or Tweety, Instagram, and any of that kind of stuff. But I grew up in the segregated South in the 1960s when we had real racism. We were bused. We couldn't go to restaurants or restaurant we wanted to. Access was denied. We had lynching in my mom's and dad's neighborhood, whatever. A lot of Black boys were lynched back then. And guess what? There was no safe spaces. It is an insult to people that grew up in my generation to hear these young kids talking about racism when they have no idea what they're talking about. Okay, when we came here 400 years ago in 4,400 years ago, okay, we were tortured, we were raped for just trying to learn how to read. Guess what? Black people read anyway. We were the workers and the inventors. Okay, we could not use racism as an excuse because it was not allowed. Okay, Blacks were well educated. If you look at Hidden Figures, we were with the mathematicians and the scientists. We sent a man into space with a chalkboard and a piece of chalk with no computer and no calculator. Okay, now what happened to us back then, and when I was growing up, 90% of the household were moms and dads. Then you had grandmothers, you had aunties, you had uncles, and our communities were strong. We were thriving. From that period of time, the government got involved, and what they did came in welfare programs. When we were growing up, there was no welfare program. You had to work, and everybody worked. During that period of time when the welfare programs came on, they put all these Black women on welfare, but in order for you to get the welfare women, the man had to leave the household. That decimated our community. We took that money and we sold our soul for 30 pieces of silver. What racism looks like today is when you have 80% of our Black children are born, with single moms. When you have a large majority of Black boys can't even read, they can't write, they can't take advantage of the opportunities because they don't have educational system. Now these cities have been given billions of dollars over the last 60 years to try to alleviate this problem. Where's the money? Why is the money now with all these other groups coming in? Nothing is going to these communities. They look worse than third world countries right now, and Black people are living in the inner cities in hellholes. Okay, this has been going on, just didn't start a month ago, it's been going on for 60 years now in our communities. You do not have a police problem. What you have is a violence in the inner city problem that no one is addressing. Police kill very few Black people every year, whatever. What's killing Black people is 75 to 80 to 8,000 Black people killing themselves.
30 seconds, unmute and keep going. I give you a little extra time. So go ahead and unmute and then keep going. You have 30 seconds left.
I'm sorry, I told you not technology. So we don't need more resolutions because I'm hearing cities all over the place doing resolution. What you need to do is go to work. Resolution is a lazy person's way of saying we don't want to do anything. So you need to take all that money that's coming into these so-called groups right now, millions of dollars that's going in these pockets of all these different groups that haven't done anything. Take that money and put it directly into the communities. And if you would do that, you would see a flourishment. But we got to work to try to rebuild these families. And if you've never been to the inner cities, you've never helped a Black child, you're a hypocrite and you have no business out there protesting. You've never helped anybody at all in our communities. And people like me are really.
All right, I'm going to ask you to wrap up. unmute and you can finish your sentence.
Oh no, I'm through.
Okay, alrighty. So as I said, yep, jazz hands, absolutely, for our speaker. And we are not taking questions because we're so short on time. But I just want to remind everybody that this is a really intense subject. And so I appreciate everybody sharing what they've got. So we are now going to go to, I really want to take like just 2 more speeches, although we're almost at our limit. So I'm going to ask for 2 1-minute speeches. I'm looking for one first in the affirmative. So raise your hand if you want to speak in the affirmative. That is that we should embrace radical systemic change. Let's go with Bob Tariba from Winona, Minnesota. 1 minute speech in the affirmative.
All right, thanks, Madam Chair. In terms of the time limitations, when I think of change, I think of like first order change or second order change. And first order change is kind of like the change where the old adage, the more things change, the more they stay the same. And it seems to me that there's a need in addressing this topic in terms of second order change, which is more substantive, more substantial, more transformational. And I think that's the crux of the matter. And I think I equate second order change with the use of the term radical. I think we need that second order change that really changes things. And so I'm in favor of the, I speak in the affirmative, but I just offer that observation. I think that's what we really need to get at. Thank you.
All right, very good. And with that, the speaker is thanked. So I'm gonna look for one final speech in the negative, and I'm sorry to all of you who want to speak but can't. I know that there's a lot of folks out there, and we're gonna go with Juan Torres. You have 1 minute, go for it.
Okay, I don't think I would say that I am on the negative, more just confused, maybe a little skeptical. Maybe I have just a few questions. Sometimes I don't know if we're talking about racism or racial disparities. It seems like we think that all racial disparities are due to racism. I'm not so sure that might be the case. I also don't understand how racial disparities exemplify racism. For example, I was looking at PhDs, masters, and bachelors who got them on 2018 and 2018, and it seemed like Asians were overrepresented, followed by whites, followed by blacks, followed by Latinos. So does that mean that the system is rigged against Latinos and in favor of Asians? I'm a little confused about that. And I think with reference to the legacy of slavery, I've read some books from Thomas Sowell, and I would just love in the future people that are more informed than me to maybe give me some feedback on his opinions. It just seems like he makes it look like the Black family, for example, was more intact before the 80s, and I think some of the other speakers were bringing that up as well. So I just find it a little confusing. Yeah, so I don't know, if America was built for white people, why do Asians and Nigerians seem to be overrepresented in positions of power? Economically, like highest earners. I don't know, it just kind of doesn't make sense to me. I'm an immigrant trying to learn over here, so I apologize if I offend anybody, just trying to understand.
All right, wonderful. And with that, the speaker is thanked. I appreciate all of that already. His humility and his humor and his facts. So with that, we're unfortunately going to have to wrap up speeches, but don't go anywhere because there are 2 other quick things we're going to do before we go. Before we do that, though, because I'm a stickler for parliamentary procedure, we're gonna do technically we're gonna move to adjourn, and then but like I said, don't go away because we've got 10 more minutes of stuff to do. So I'd like someone to make the motion to adjourn, and for that I just need you to, great, love it. Somebody else say second? Just unmute yourself. Beautiful. Second. All right, motion having been moved and seconded, we are adjourned. So first of all, give y'all no silence, it's too late. First of all, give yourselves a round of jazz hands for debating a very hard topic in a really effective way. So really well done, everybody. I think this was really, really good. What we're gonna do now is just a quick reflection, and I'd like everybody to answer 2 questions. You can answer one of them or both of them. And they are, what did you learn from the last hour and a half or 2 hours of conversation? And what did you enjoy? And just go ahead and raise your hand like you have been for a speech, and I'll call on you, and we will take as many as we have time for. Tyler Anderson, John's brother. Go ahead.
Hi. I've learned that there's that there's for sure a difference between classism and racism, you know, and I understand how the opposing side is trying to say that, like, we can't mix the two, and that's the reason why we shouldn't necessarily call for radical systemic change. And I somewhat agree with that a little bit more now, you know, that, like, there is a clear difference and they should be addressed in different ways. But I enjoyed that there are those 2 differences, and that this is a problem that's a little bit more intricate than we really believe it to be. You know, it's a lot more food for thought.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thank you. Joe M., what did you learn or what did you enjoy?
I learned that I have an extreme amount of value for Sherry Gilliam. She's actually been there. She's seen real racism. She's actually lived it. I do. I'm 71. I remember the segregated bathrooms and all that, and all this crying and, you know, pissing and moaning, all systemic racism, bad. No, it's not. It's not. It's long gone. And I think now it's up to the Black.
So I'm just going to remind you that this is what did you learn or what did you enjoy, not a speech. Everybody always wants to give speeches in this section. So go ahead and unmute and you can finish your point.
I enjoyed her observation that the young Black folks just need to get it in gear, go to work, quit, you know, whining about, you know, everything's wrong, poor me. Get out there, get after it, take care of your babies, take care of your family, and everything's going to be fine. Thank you.
All righty. So you appreciated Sherry Gilliam. Sherry, I don't know if you're still there, but know that you have a fan. I'd like to call on.
Still here.
All righty. You've got a fan. You've got more than one, actually. I've been sending you chats with positive comments from folks. Let's go to Gail Rubin from Dallas. What did you learn or what did you enjoy?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Gail Rubin, Dallas, from Illinois. So I learned that while it's one of our greatest tools, that I think oftentimes many of us are tripped up by language. And I feel like with this resolution, and maybe with even some others that I've attended the debates, we're in, you know, how we might interpret 1 or 2 words, and whether that's the same interpretation as somebody else, it might trip us up sometimes. So anyway, just throwing that out there. And I really enjoyed the frankness that everybody brought to their comments. And I want to thank everybody who spoke in any capacity. I didn't, you know, I raised my hand. There's lots of hands up there, but it's only through this that we are going to enhance our perspectives. And I really appreciate what everybody brought to it.
All righty. Thank you. Yeah. Let's go to Greg Sewell.
All right, thanks for letting me share again. I definitely want to say I was encouraged by, you know, the honesty of everyone. So I'll echo what Gail from Dallas was talking about. And I also, you know, learned that even with the pendulum swinging so widely, depending on how we see things individually, it's really good to see people willing to listen and engage without attacking or feeling attacked. That to me is really important. I very much appreciate what everyone said here. I think Braver Angels is onto something, but really the people in this room are the solution. I just will say that. I'm convinced of that more than ever. So I appreciate you, April, and I appreciate everybody, positive, negative, affirmative, whatever the right word is. Appreciate that.
I love that. I totally agree. You all are the solution. That's wonderful. Thank you, Greg. Pamela Landon, go ahead, unmute yourself. And what did you learn or what did you enjoy?
First of all, thank you, Braver Angels, and thank you to all the participants. This was hard. This was really hard. my daughter is biracial, and when the protest started, I watched and I watched and I watched, and it was hard. And there was a couple things my daughter and I talked about, and she said to me, "Mom, you must watch. You cannot turn away when it's ugly." And the reason why I share that is today it was difficult to respectfully listen to people that opposed as strongly as I believe. And I'm grateful that I did. I'm very grateful, and I'm grateful that this was provided a safe space for people to feel they could share things that normally people may not talk about. So thank you everybody for what you did. May we all be blessed on this journey to find.
Absolutely. Amen. Yeah, lots of jazz hands for that. Colette Harrison, go ahead.
Thank you. As has been said, particularly by Gail Rubin and others, I also learned that it's very important for us to come to a common understanding of the terminology we're using, because we say these words and we all have images in our heads of what they mean. So we're coming from different perspectives and different backgrounds and histories that we bring with us. And until we can have common understanding of what we're talking about, we can't really affect change in any positive way. And what I enjoyed was the way this whole thing unfolded, and the challenges of responding in a way that is not as comfortable as directly engaging the speakers. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Let's go with Amy and Josie.
Just Amy for the moment. Thank you to Pamela for mentioning the difficulty of listening. I've loved this, and I have great respect for everyone who spoke. I learned to begin to listen better to the individual responsibility arguments, and to understand better something that's puzzled me for a while, which is the strength of certain attitudes from my Black neighbors who take positions like some that I heard today that are very different from ones that I've been exposed to before. It's sort of standing up for individual responsibility. But I also have been very troubled because I didn't hear from anyone tonight. I didn't expect to, but like no one here was saying, "I'm afraid for my life." And what I heard from some on the neg side was really those people being dismissed as whiners. And I believe in really listening to people when they tell you that they're in pain. And so that's hard. I also learned to appreciate maybe some of the generational difference between some of the speakers here and the younger crowd that I need to learn in my teaching role. So I'm more aware of the difference it makes when you've been through the civil rights struggle and look at racism today and how hard it might be to really see and hear the suffering that the people are representing, that they're experiencing today.
All right, and because we're getting close to the top of the hour, we have one more thing to do. We're going to end with Daryl Theus. Daryl, go ahead.
Madam Chair, thank you. I learned that we're far more alike than we are different, and that we all seem to equally love this country of ours. I especially enjoyed the passion that mostly all of us advanced arguments with. I wish everyone well, and thank you, Braver Angels, for inviting me. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, one more round of jazz hands for everybody. Okay. So just one more thing. I would like to, so Braver Angels is a membership organization, and we just want to ask you to encourage y'all to think about becoming part of our army. And so David and Maya, if you would unmute and tell us what you've got to say, that would be great.
I'd love to. So one of the benefits that becoming a membership provides for $10 a month, which is roughly, I'm sorry, $10 a year, which is roughly 83 cents a month, I was able to participate in a Braver Angels workshop this past February where I learned a lot of things about our country, and that is that we can come together if we understand that we see each other as unconditionally American. And what that means is that despite what poll numbers tell us that, you know, we're more right than you are because these numbers, we can look past the numbers and listen to each other. And because of that, you know, despite the pandemic and because of contributions that Braver Angels has allocated, we're able to continue this in the midst of a pandemic when I'm really proud to be a part of this organization because we don't let something as tragic as a health crisis get in the way of doing our civic duty to depolarizing our nation, especially when the narrative and culture is so tribal, when everyone in this room had something so unique to say and something so reinforcing to my hope in this country. So thank you all. Become a member, trying to become moderators or whatever will get you situated here. Thank you.
I just want to say, though, if $10 is all you can give, it's a pandemic, of course. But if you can give $100 or you can give $200, like, this is worth a lot more to me than a lot of things I give money to. So I just want to say, if you got to give it, you know, I spend more on my Apple Music subscription than I might give to on this, and that seems silly to me because I care a lot more about this.
All right, wonderful, thank you. And with that, I just want to have us all close out with one more round of jazz hands. Gotta love everybody who spoke tonight, everybody who asked questions. Those of you who couldn't, yeah, like I see some style, Tyler. There's some jazz hands like this. Yes, very good. Yeah, so thanks everybody. This was wonderful, and have a great night.